Journey Across Jean's Saga, Book 1, Now, Then, to Come, Part 1, Now, Chapter 4, Turning. The sound of neighbors greeting your partner from across the path leading to your dwelling wakes you up. Nop is starting to take its descent into the horizon, and neighbors are slowly getting up to cook breakfast. The smell of boiled root vegetables and grilled doughs fill the dusky air. "Happy turning," Dolores greets a neighbor, smiling a big, toothy grin, one of her two very front teeth chipped and jagged. "Good breakfast, Mester. Happy turning to you. Looking forward to tonight's ceremony." The neighbor to the left of your dwelling tips their woven hat in her direction, ubiquitous Atmanidi gear worn by day workers mostly. Some activities like roof repair and other maintenance require the light of day and are usually started when Nop is at a lower point in the sky before beginning its daily descent toward mid-sky, or in this case, its nightly descent into the horizon. Few venture out during the scorching hours. Overwatchers and foragers who have the cover of tree canopy, at least when the leaves are in full bloom. You watch the interaction through the gaps in the thatched wall from your hammock. You can hear other conversations happening in the general vicinity of your dwelling. There's a lot of excitement in the air already, and Nop is only just now penetrating the sparsely leafed upper canopy of the tree line that encloses the eastern side of the encampment. You're due at the refectory to help gather kindling and firewood for the bonfires. If all goes as planned, the waterfetchers will be arriving within several hours. The festivities, however, begin in full swing as soon as Nop disappears completely. That's how it has always been since you can remember. Year after year, when the waterfetchers come back from the old river with their offering of life, along with an identity of their choosing, the community comes together to throw them a big welcome-back party. "Come, Tesht. I've made pumpkin porridge. It's still warm." The invisible string tugs at your chest and you hear your own voice inside your thoughts. It's Dolores. You know unmistakably that it's her. Her tug is unique, subtly different from Teyuti's, but different enough. Teyuti's tug at the moment is more taut, distant. They is still on overwatch duty. They'll be home in time for festivities. That's when their shift ends. Both of your partners are your distant cousins, and so you share some genetic makeup, more or less 50 centimorgans or 50 million chromosomal base pairs. But you don't know that. All you know is that you can connect with them telepathically, so you must be related somehow. Dolores and you are fairly close cousins. However, you're probably Teyuti's fourth cousin or so, which means you'd share a fourth great-grandparent with them. Normally, elders like yourself, Dolores, and Teyuti are exempt from overwatch duty, but with preparations for turning in full swing, the younger, stronger, more agile community members are needed for hauling wood, carrying heavy baskets of pumpkins, butternut, and other squashes used as the main source of protein in the extravagant dishes. Turning 16 is the most lavish of the festivities, and is when the harvest stores are used up so they don't have to be hauled to the new settlement. You're reminded that you're not particularly looking forward to this upcoming move. You've never quite agreed with the tradition of moving camp every year at the onset of reawakening. It's a lot of work, not to mention its origin is apocryphal, engendered in superstition that, for your scientific mind, a topic that you and one of your partners in particular, Dolores, disagree on. She's always been a bit too superstitious for your liking. You bring your focus back to the festivities. This is a time for celebration, and the festivities will do your people some good. Some time has passed since those scorching marauders stole away someone very special to you. Teyuti still wakes up in the middle of the scorching hours, calling out for her. The link between them and Ursula has been severed. Ursula is your eldest child, an adult in her 40th reawakening, that was snatched away a few holds back. That doesn't mean she's dead. She could just be out of range. You pray to Ishten, more out of habit than actual belief, that she is only just outside of your telepathic field and that she isn't suffering. Octavia, your second child, also an adult tens of reawakenings old, Dolores' egg progeny, has also lost the connection with Ursula. It's been really hard for her. All of this is to say that these festivities are going to be a welcome distraction. Ever since the waterfetchers set off on their journey, you've been preparing. Out of all the celebrations, this might be your favorite. You know that it's Dolores' favorite one. She loves weaving stories. And the ones about your community's inception, she's especially good at telling them. They're very exciting after all, full of action and conflict. The story of the last ones, the story of the genesis of your community. Dolores is so damned good at telling them too. Out of all the arts that she practices and mentors in, she excels the most at storytelling. She practices for hours on end as soon as the waterfetchers leave the camp. After decades of telling the tales, one would think that she'd have a script memorized, but she likes to tell it differently each time. She really has a brilliant imagination. I'm getting up. You excited about your big day, Tesht? Your body aches as you slide out of the bed swing. Your body's telling you that you've been busy at work in preparation for the turning. Your hands are particularly sore from all the peeling, slicing, chopping, and mixing. The festivities begin tonight and last for several nights, usually 4 or 5. The weather usually has an impact on the activities. You can only remember a handful of years when the rain and windstorms put a damper on the revelry. What a disappointment those celebrations were, you think. You look up at the sky. It's rather clear. There's no sign of rain. A little bit of rain would be welcome, however. Not too much. Just a bit is always welcome. After you finish your squash porridge, you walk to the communal gardens to check on the seedlings. You notice how the peppers and tomatoes are sprouting nicely. You chose to start the knop revolvers, sunflowers, in the compostable pots this year as well, since the unexpected frost from last sowing killed most of them off. You did manage to save a few, but not enough to fill the stores. Malna, Makk, and Gomba's egg blood is filling the water kana from not faded blue rain barrel. Good breakfast, Tesht. He pulls invisible energy toward his heart with his free hand. We're going to have to beg the water makers to use the reserves. I just used the last of the barrel water. Good luck getting a drop from them. I tried yesterday, and your partner denied me. Maybe you can use your partnerly charm. My cousinly charm seemed to have no effect on them. You close both of your eyes quickly, intermittently, indicating your playfulness. A slight grimace unfolds on your freckled brown face. I think you'd have better luck. Bodza has been in a mood since Makk has been gone. He tips the barrel to get the last few drops from the spigot. It really bothers them that we have no way of sensing them like we can Gombi. I'm sure they'll figure out how to connect eventually. You try to give some words of encouragement, despite your own doubt about Makk's telepathic ability. Remember that one youngin' who left the community a few decades back? What was their name? You pause, digging deep into your long-term memory files. You're definitely feeling your age this morning. Accessing memories from that long ago is no easy task these days. You're well into your 6th decade after all. Hegi, was it? They didn't get their ability until long after puberty. There's still hope. Malna shrugs his shoulders, back still turned to you. I'll finish watering the garden. Go on ahead and do whatever's left for preparations. You thank him and head out past the watermaker's shelter. The sky grows ever darker. You notice the orange and purple hues in the eastern horizon. There's so much beauty in this world, even among the ugliness. Where on this scorched earth can you be, Ursula? Your thoughts flash back to the day she was taken. You hear the echoes of her screams, the memories still fresh in your mind. If only you were younger, you'd still be out there looking for her. The severed cord that lost its tug that day feels like a void in your chest. Will you ever connect with her again? Those scorching marauders will pay someday. I'll get you back, my Ursula. Just hold on. We'll come for you. You mind speak into the ether, wandering slowly toward the refectory. You haven't given up hope. Hope is the one thing those scorching bastards can't take away from you. Hope is your only weapon against despair. So you continue to hope. Din from the festivities can be heard well before the Overwatcher stops them and asks for the code, a necessary precaution for a truly xenophobic people. The dimly lit jugs of water confirm the identity of the approaching group. The 3 dogs running toward camp had been the first indication that the waterfetchers had made it back. But aren't there 12 travelers, 3 dogs and 9 humans? Where are the other 2 humans? Makk and Gomba fell behind to make sure no one was following us. Sylvie shares with the Overwatcher, who just happens to be their older body blood. Welcome back, Tesht. Welcome back to all you 16s. Happy reawakening. Drink some honey palinka for me. From the looks of it, you've already been helping yourself to an abundance, Tesht. Sylvie giggles in silence as they gives their body blood a tight squeeze, exchanging thoughts. They kisses them on the cheek. Do we ever have some stories for you? Sylvie shares. Their body blood kisses them back on their right cheek and signals the others to open the gate. All is good. Open up. The gatekeeper unhinges the metal rod from the iron gate, a leftover from the old world. It's one of the few scavenged items from the forbidden dwellings left vacant after the Great Dying. It takes 2 of them to wield the heft of the cold, rusted steel bars. Several of the waterfetchers drop their heavy jugs on the ground and sit while the aperture to the community is opened. Hold is in full shine, and the night is truly beautiful. The sky is clear, and the stars that other worlds orbit around peer down upon this once bustling earth. There's a peacefulness, despite the raucous clamor of music, laughter, and conversation reverberating from within the commune. On the other side of the encampment, jugs in hand, 2 other cloaked travelers are being stopped, while a third, draped in a blanket of sorts, sneaks past the lesser-used gate and stealthily darts toward the opening that they've been using for the past year to weasel in and out of the camp unseen. Makk has always been a loner and frequently sneaks out of the walled community to seek solitude in the nearby thicket. Not wanting to alert the Overwatchers each time they scurries off, they created a hole in the fence-like wall near their unit's dwelling just small enough for their body to squeeze through. They sheds their blanket and pushes through the diminutive opening. As Makk creeps toward the shelter of their intim unit, the smell of langosh fills their nostrils, savory, yeasty acorn flour dough, deep-fried in Nop revolver oil. They can almost feel the texture of the chewy inside and the slightly crunchy outer crust. Their mouth waters for the juicy toppings, thinly sliced purple onions, nut quark cream, and garlic. Lots of garlic. A remnant of centuries past eaten at farmers' markets and during vacations at Lake Balaton before it dried up. Langosh is something of an indulgence during special celebrations, during the turning, harvesting, and right before Olvash. Makk's stomach begins to growl uncontrollably. Has it been that long since they had last eaten? With all the excitement, the trek back to camp from the old river flew by like a hooded crow seeking refuge from the scorching hours, caught unawares by Nop's deadly rays as it lost track of time while feasting on its carrion lunch. All of the waterfetchers and their new companion will be feasting soon, too. That is if the Atmanetti aren't alerted to the presence of the unexpected and probably first unwelcome guest. Just as planned, and as Makk is putting on some clothes after having spent the trek naked and covered only by bed-clothing, Gomba and Takver sneak into the dwelling. Makk stayed merged with Takver the whole time and knew things were fine, as far as getting past the Overwatcher gatekeepers, but is still relieved when the 2 cloaked figures appear. Makk takes Takver by the shoulders and hugs her. Then they focus on Gomba. Do you think anyone suspects anything? Gomba shakes his head while removing his cloak, walks over to a hanging basket and grabs a fresh change of clothes. I'm going to wash up before joining the bully. I'm hungry and you both must be too. If it hadn't been for the bully, party, or celebration, they most likely wouldn't have managed to sneak a stranger into the community so easily. Takver admires her tortlit surroundings, tent-like, nettlecloth patchwork roof, vine-woven walls, and basket-like containers positioned all around the dwelling. Half-hung hammocks swing from a thick beam that is attached to an even wider tree from under which the hut-like structure was constructed. A different opening from the one from which they entered leads to the other half of the structure. What's through this opening? Takver thinks to Makk. The 3 had decided that it was best to keep her presence a secret from the other waterfetchers, hence, she traveled in silence. That wasn't difficult because she can't talk, and they kept conversation between the 3 of them, Makk interpreting Takver's thoughts aloud for Gomba, to a minimum. The dogs would know she was around, of course, and hopefully wouldn't blow their cover, But the dogs hadn't seemed to be too concerned about the friendly human whose scent was all over Makk and Gomba. Also, it had been decided that Takver would follow the group while giving them a distant berth and staying off the trail and on the periphery of the old road. Makk and Gomba explained that they would fall behind the group to help keep watch of the dangers that might approach from behind. Chippy and Rocky would go ahead a bit and alert Guesty of any possible dangers. Guesty would then tell the larger group. The dogs, per usual, would also constantly go ahead and behind the group since that is what they did almost instinctively. Wouldn't it make more sense to have Cheri or Jerry fall behind with one of you? Then they could actually share the approaching danger with their body blood in the bigger group. Rocky interjected, suspicious of the suggestion from the two body bloods. After several minutes, the group reached a consensus. Gomba and Makk fell behind the larger group. That way they were able to discuss how in the scorching nop they were going to sneak a stranger into camp, in whispers, of course. And what were they going to do with her once they snuck her in? Takver enters the opening that is the threshold to a smaller thatched shelter. More woven hammocks hang from another beam. Fewer baskets line the vined walls. The raised floors are covered in more woven fabrics, thicker than the hammocks. Makk follows her into the room with the torch. This is where our adults sleep. Now that Gombi and I have turned 16, after we move camp, we can choose to stay with our Intim unit in their new dwelling or build our own shelter. We can start an Intim unit as well if that's what we want to do. Gomba, undressing and gathering water to wash up before changing clothes, speaks to the two from the other side of the divide. We need to figure out what to do with her. She can't just stay here out in the open. Oh, horse dong. What's wrong, Tesht? Gomba, examining the crotch of his underwear, discovers blood spots. He started his period, menstruation cycle. No wonder he had been feeling a bit hormonally off-kilter during the trek back. I'm fine. Let's just figure out what we're going to do. We need to hurry. Our people are going to be wondering where we are. As the night draws on, the festivities continue. Gomba goes off toward the bonfires to sit with his Intim unit while Makk grabs a langosh, fresh out of the frying pot, and appropriates several pogacha, biscuit-like savory pastries, in the deep pockets of their robe. Takver needs to eat too. The langosh is a massive, circular, doughy disc and can easily be shared by two people. The nut cork topping oozes down their arm, coating the sleeve of their nettle-knit, long-sleeve frock. The spinach-dyed greenish ochre hue of the frock glows as they hurry past the flames toward the beech tree where Takver is hiding. It's chilly outside, but not too chilly that a second layer is needed, especially for those sitting around the fire pits. Takver is hiding in the perfect spot, halfway up a beech tree on the periphery of the edge of camp. That way she is out of sight of the passers-by and can get a clear view of the pop-up stage amidst the glowing embers of the bonfires. She won't want to miss the storytelling. Makk assures her that it is worth watching, but of course she is anxious, and yet strangely relieved to be around so many people again. For far too long she had been hiding and running, alone, always alone. Would the perpetual solitude ever end? The beating of the drums comes to a sudden halt and then starts again, but more slowly. This is the signal that the stories are about to begin. Makk climbs down the tree, crosses to the refectory, and joins their Intim unit that is sitting near one of the fires. The invisible rope between Makk and Takver stretches and becomes a bit more taut than it had done since the two siblings met and shared at the old river. Takver watches as several big and small people jump to their feet out of excitement and embrace Makk. Simultaneously, Makk lets her share the feelings of warmth and love that penetrate their body from the genuine welcome. Yet, Makk is giving off a vibe of distrust that Takver perceives as a negative sensation, but no more nuanced than that. Makk's nether blood starts to ask how the trip was, but there's no time for questions or any chit-chat at all. Just then, Old Mester enters the stage and stands in the center of the 5 bonfire pits. Her face flickers in the incandescent lighting from the roaring flames. Silence all around. Everyone stares at the stage. There was, where there was not, across 7 seas, over the high glass mountain, above the pits of poison that were left to us by the ones who came before and destroyed the world, there was a great dying. A tinge of blues and purples begins to overcome Takver's inward eye. They are very soothing, and she knows they must be coming from Makk, shared intentionally or not. There must be tens of stories that Makk has heard over and over for as long as they can remember. This is one of the stories that they cherish the most, the story of how their community began hundreds of reawakenings before. Takver silently shifts on her branch perch. From the monumental beech tree, she stares down at the fire-illuminated community. She counts 15 or so groups of 3 to 5 people gathered in the shape of a crescent moon with the 5 fire pits at the belly. Whether the dogs understand the spoken words, they too rest among the humans. Takver must have counted a handful. The old woman at the center of it all takes turns approaching the different fires. Barefoot, she carries a staff-like walking stick, whose end from time to time she uses to stir red-orange coals from the various fire pits. That sends up sparks, adding a dramatic flair to the tale she weaves. Even the youngest of the children are still and watch as the story weaver seemingly dances on her stage. Although the old woman is the main narrator of the story, there are others who join her on stage. Some even dress in the costumes that the ancient peoples wore before the Great Dying. Long, thick, finely knitted bottoms dyed a dark blue, faded at the knees, tops with writings and images, a cloth head ornament with a piece that protrudes over the brow, providing protection from Nop, items that are found in the trash heaps of old, buried under open areas used for human recreation long ago. Takver herself had grown up hearing stories of how some of the centuries-old, crumbling ruins were once vibrant, multi-storied markets filled with room after room with variations of the same clothing. These buildings were massive edifices. Mechanical stairs and metallic and glass boxes that rose and fell moved hordes of stationary people from level to level. Massive corridors had been lined with shops and dotted with kiosks as far as the eye could see. Nowadays, most people didn't dare go into these buildings in ruins. Entering or exploring the old buildings was strictly forbidden. Bad luck. Curses of old would follow the families of those who broke the rules. But that didn't stop Takver's people. They were some of the few people who used the ruins, and look where it got them. As the theatrics continue, Takver can sense an uneasiness coming from her long-lost sibling. She brings her focus back to the live reenactment. She will stop letting her mind wander so easily. After constantly being alone for years, she's come accustomed to living in her memories and thoughts. Makk listens as old Meshter tells the trying tale of the original 7 ancestors who survived the last massive wave of diseases and destruction. This, of course, isn't the first time they've heard the story of the last ones and the crucibles of their continuity in hell on earth. In fact, this story has always been a part of their memory since they could remember comprehending the spoken word. Reawakening after reawakening, old Meshter recounts the story when the waterfetchers return from their journey. The last ones hadn't always known true hunger or thirst. Oh, a thirst that burned in the throat, worse than a skin burn from Nop's scorching touch. No, they hadn't always known those horrors. They had come from families of excess. According to the tales, 5 of the original 7 had lived rather comfortable lives compared to most humans that lived during their time. They were the children of the most prominent people in their walled city, one of those megacore towns from the old world where everyone who lived outside the innermost wall was somehow beholden to, or rather enslaved by, the small group of wealthy proprietors and their lackeys inside. The parents of the 5 teenagers worked for the megacores, heads of the private security body that eventually replaced the publicly funded police force. Peace Force, as they had rebranded themselves. They worked alongside CEOs, managers, politicians, and others who worked behind the scenes to create media content that saturated the devices that almost everyone wore on their eye, like a contact lens, just covering the cornea. Buy this, buy that, buy now, constantly popped up like the ads on the smartphones of the 21st century, 100 years before the Great Dying. Messages like, almost out of stock, wall coat credits only, or don't trust anyone, your neighbor or your coworker isn't your friend. If you need help, call a peace officer. And there was an abundance of peace officers. It was during the mid-21st century, when the salary of peace officers, or rather obedience enforcers, rose above that of anyone in the medical field, including anesthesiologists and even brain and heart surgeons, despite heart disease being on the rise. It was a time of great wealth disparities, but even greater ideological cohesion, at least among the elite families. Members of those families held prestigious positions in the megacorps and its many institutions, and lived in mansions on hills surrounded by impenetrable walls. On the other hand, the workers who were paid in wall coke credits only lived in makeshift shelters or run-down warehouses below. And the workers were few. The unemployed were many, having been mostly replaced by automated equivalents. The wall coke credits didn't get them through the month. Necessities like running water and access to other important infrastructure were a luxury that most couldn't afford. So, most workers, if not all, ended up borrowing credits from the megacorps bank. Credit debt was nearly impossible to pay back. The debt became perpetual. 2 and 3 generations of workers inherited their family's debt. Outside the walled city, the dominated forces used violence and the threat of imprisonment or even death to coerce the poor on a daily basis. Many of the working poor died during the construction of the walls that towered around the megacorps towns to keep out the hordes of unwanted transients who roamed from place to place looking for shelter, food, and work, anything that could provide them a little comfort. Yet while most of the desperate people on the outside were trying to break through the outermost wall to get in, those 5 young 16-year-olds were desperate to run away from it all. They decided to run away once they were old enough to understand, truly understand, how things worked in wall coke, how the machinists that maintained the robotic machines at the manufacturing plant that assembled the armored cars they rode in had to walk over an hour to get to work one way, rain or shine, and how every weekend that same armored vehicle, operated by Ace, the automated car engineer, collected the students from the indoctrination center and took them up through the winding underground tunnels to their palace-like homes. How the Anns, automated nannies and nurses, had a hot meal ready for them in a dining room upon arrival. How they had never met anyone in their own age that didn't live in a mansion. How was that even possible? Monotonous subjects taught in the indoctrination centers trained them to be good little soldiers for the megacorps town. Managing the undeserving, war and profit, generational wealth and debt, among others. Peacekeeping was the least favorite subject of Scrip, the youngest and most fervently vocal of the 5 friends. The idea that peace is something that you have to beat into people seemed riddled with paradox. Among the inseparable 5, each of them secretly had a name that they'd given themselves, a name that reflected their skills and interests. Also, none of them identified with the sex that had been signed at birth. None of them dared to perform their true gender identity for fear of being burned alive, like the people in the projections they saw in peacekeeping class. There was one particular projection from the year 2045 during what they called the Great Gender Cleansing. Transgendered women and men and gender non-conforming individuals were stripped naked, tied to poles, genitally mutilated, covered in some combustible viscous liquid, and then set afire, burned alive while hundreds, thousands of spectators stood around and watched, applauding while drinking their iced coffees and smoothies. Rows of children on a field trip sat in the front row, eating confections sold in the concession stands. That happened all over the world, as the history was told. It was because of that projection in particular that the 5 friends discovered each other. They were the only 5 in the class that weren't laughing and sneering during the projection, and after that lesson, they began to hang out. Each one realized that they were finally not alone, and none of them could bear another school year of indoctrination, another day of being misgendered, another day of sitting next to classmates who thrived in school, who thrived under a hierarchical system that permitted them certain privileges so that they too could walk all over someone else, to have someone to compare themselves to make themselves feel superior, who talked about nothing more than their killing projection games, the promotions of their parents, and the new things they bought on the intrawebs. No, not another day, especially not since Scrip introduced them to a short story that had been written over 100 years prior. They'd been lounging in the common area with about 15 other boarders, where the different dormitories intersected. The glossy white walls gave the room a sterile feel, a bright feel, despite the charcoal clouds in the sky and the cold, sharp rain tapping against the pane of the glass wall. White chairs with high, erect backs dotted the room, filled with studious bodies looking outward as if staring at nothing. Other students were sprawled out along the floor on white styrofoam mats, also gazing off into the distance. But they weren't staring at nothing. No, they were all very much engaged with the device that cradled their cornea. Some were reading through their notes. There was a big test the next day, and they were busy memorizing dates and names of events and people from long ago that they could care less about. Others were playing some shooting game or another. Those ones were obviously not reading, given the ever-changing facial expressions that they wore, as well as the sudden jerk of the body as if they'd been hit by a projectile of some sort. The ones studying sat still, not speaking a word, although some were listening to music while they worked on their memorization, occasionally bobbing their head to the beat. From time to time, people would get up to use the facilities, stretch, or just move around a bit. The place had the feel of a 21st century university library, except for the pocketless uniforms and the lack of books or the absence of paper of any kind. No notebooks, no bags. Why do you need a bag? Everything you need is on your eyeball and linked into your cerebral cortex, hence the lack of desks or tables. Consumption was digital. The avatar wore the diamond necklace that someone's Aunt Jessica bought them for Christmas last year. Only 5,000 credits, buy now. Absurd. 5,000 credits could feed a downhiller family of 4 for at least a month. The 5 friends, although they were in the same room, weren't sitting next to one another. They didn't like others to notice their closeness. They'd preferred to remain anonymous and not call attention to each other or themselves. But connected through their devices, they were constantly merged, messaging back and forth. Hack, the eldest of the 5, had a talent for coding and creating or breaking into virtual private environments where the 5 could communicate and feel mostly safe behind highly encrypted firewalls filled with booby traps for the unfortunate bot or person who tried to follow them. So even though the 5 friends didn't spend much time together physically, they made up for it virtually. But they never spent too much time in one virtual place, and sometimes they met up in person. It was exciting, after all, to illegally congregate in non-designated areas. Settling the devices swoosh, swoop, swish, and ping, 4 of the 5 friends received a pop-up message on their eye projection. Script had sent them an encrypted message. Meet me in special place where surveillance bots are blind. 5 min. Using the thought keyboard software that allowed the user to think of a word and select it with a quick eye movement, Aura sent the first text in response. What are you up to now? You're going to get us in trouble. Then, Telly chimed in. This better be good, about to beat this level. Just like they had always done when they wanted to sneak away without getting caught, the 5 took staggered turns, getting up from their spots and slowly walked toward the secret meeting place, making sure not to be too obvious. Hack would configure a virus that would temporarily upset the system by scattering the location tracking and scanning of everyone for 15 minutes or so. It affected everyone in the building, making it hard to identify the perpetrators, but the system did have a failsafe. LiDAR surveillance constantly produced a 3D scan of all rooms and all movements was tracked. This was standard practice at all indoctrination centers and most public spaces, such as the mega commercial centers. If someone was gone for too long from their designated space, they'd get a pop-up notification in their iDevice warning them of their violation. The 5 would have to hurry. It wasn't the first time they'd held such an artifact, but definitely one of the few. The story itself was printed in real ink on a sheet of fibrous material that they learned in school had been called paper. It was forbidden. It was exciting. Where on earth had Script procured it? How did he smuggle it in? The uniforms had no pockets. The 5 conspirators could remember stories their grandparents told about the stuff and how you could find it everywhere. Almost everyone who was anyone had had an ink printer at home with several reams of paper on standby. Newsstands sold folded-up stacks of it and had done so for centuries. Paper was used for everything from correspondence, advertisement, schoolwork, to grocery store receipts, and for cleaning yourself after using the toilet. If you ran out, you just pop on down to the local grocery store and buy more. That particular specimen was in the shape of one of those old fanzines that they'd seen in the Walcoke Museum of Antiquities, but it was about a quarter of the size and had only 2 sheets of paper. It smelled like the courtyard did in the spring, earthy, ripe, damp. The title took up most of the front cover and competed with the realistic drawing of a medieval city on a body of water. It was colorful, although very faded. There were some tears and folds. It was definitely old. It was definitely forbidden, therefore exciting. Scrip would be in a lot of trouble if it were discovered in their possession. Every single one of them would be in big trouble, but they read it to each other anyway. The ones who walk away from Omelas. Omelas. What a funny name. It might as well have been Walcoke City for all its similarities, except that there was no sea in that megacore town, and the people who lived on the hills didn't spend time together in the streets playing music and singing. And the filthy, pus-filled, sore-ridden child that was kept in a cellar in the story could be multiplied by thousands. But those thousands lived downhill, on the other side of the wall, and the 5 friends wouldn't know how to compare the child to the downhillers. They didn't know much about them or of the world outside their walls, besides what they could see with their own eyes, and of course, what they were shown in the projections. One of the main differences between the allegorical story and the reality of the 5 friends, as well as the other moneyed people who lived uphill, was the simple fact that children at the indoctrination center didn't learn about the reality of the people who suffered down below. In the story, children of Omelas learned about the miserable existence that the small child was forced to endure so that the rest of the people in the city could have happiness and prosperity. Those were the conditions of the magic spell. Children and adults alike would go down to the dank, dreary cellar and peek in on the terrified, lonely, sickly child. Some would even throw things at it, kick it even. The very humanity was stripped away from the pathetically pitiable life of the poor little one. The worst part about the story for the 5 friends was that the truth about the child's suffering wasn't hidden. Everyone in that city knew that their full bellies and joyful lives depended on the misery of that lone child. But why that child? Certainly it must have deserved its lot in life. It must have done horrific things to be punished so. How else could it merit its dreaded existence? Was it so different from those workers that lived downhill in their own megacore town, outside the wall? After all, that is exactly what they learned in their classes. The downhillers deserved their destitution. There were the people like them, the rich, the elite, who had things because they deserved to have them. They came from proper stock, and that status quo needed to be maintained. If the downhillers only chose to work harder instead of relying on the rich to give them handouts, they could live uphill too, right? Every child learned that from the first day they stepped foot in the indoctrination centers. And how would they know any different? There was no interaction allowed between those that lived above and those that lived below. It was illegal. Forbidden. Wealthy children had no business going downhill. The automated mega commercial centers uphill had everything they needed: digi-shops, food courts, 5D projection cinemas, and more digi-shops. There were no human workers to run those operations. Everything was automated. If you wanted a bit of outdoor recreation, the parks and forests up above were more spectacular than those down below, outside the wall. At least, that is what they learned in the centers. Did they even have parks downhill? Of course, kids were kids, and the curiosity of the elite kids would get them close to the edge of the hills, but the wall that separated uphill from downhill was only ever traversed virtually. 5D projection games allowed computer-generated exploration of the squalor and dangers of down below. No child needed to risk their life to venture down below to see for themselves. Yet, after reading the story, the forbidden story in its forbidden format with its forbidden media, the 5 friends made a pact. They would find out the truth for themselves. After weeks of planning, the 5 friends, Scrip, Hack, Boots, Telly, and Aura, decided to disguise themselves as downhillers and uncover the truth. But what did downhillers look like? What did they wear? How did they interact? What did they sound like? Were they that different from uphillers? The 5 some didn't believe the images and stories of the downhillers that were curated for them in the projections. Augmented reality was commonplace uphill, after all. It would have been easy to fake the reality of the downhillers. With the lens in place Everyone's environment was augmented, superimposed upon with advertisements, flashing arrows that appeared to flow from your feet, providing you with the latest update on the quickest path to your destination. If you veered from the path, the dotted line arrow turned from green to red and redirected you. If you strayed off course too often, the automated peace officer bot popped up in the middle of your viewing, inquiring if you needed assistance and stopping you in your tracks. That is, unless you were someone like Hack, who always had a command at hand, or rather on thought, that minimized the interference and threw it off to the periphery, no longer obstructing vision. But hacking into the system and making those around you see an augmented version of you only worked if they wore their lens. Someone without the lens in place wouldn't see your purple hair or the flashy outfit that you projected onto yourself virtually. They would see your white uniform if you're a student, whatever the natural state of your hair was in. Virtually augmented disguises would only work on the downhillers if the downhillers also wore the lenses. Either way, the 5 wayfarers were not safe from the so-called peace officers that patrolled downhill. They would have their lenses in place, but they could easily deactivate a wardrobe and see what uniform awaited underneath. And was wearing the lens or keeping a drone activated while out in public mandated there in downhill like it was in uphill? And how would the downhillers treat an uphiller if they came across one on a dim-lit street? Not well, if they were to believe the projections that were shown in class and also in the games they played. Not if they could be identified as a possible rich brat whose recovery would be worth whatever amount of credits they demanded for their ransom. Since Hack was the great purveyor of information procured through digital means, he was able to break through firewalls that kept the uphill populace ignorant of the reality outside the wall. For a fairly hefty price, one of Hack's contacts among the downhillers provided him with intel on a transport vehicular that carried supplies and goods in and out of the walled hills through the vast subterranean interwebbed rail system. Hack was excellent at tinkering with electronics and would have to disable the sensors in a specific food transport vehicular that was suspended in a loading bay under the indoctrination center. There would be a change of clothes for each of the 5, as well as a drone for each. Uphillers had had drones, antiquated technology, years before, back when the 5 friends were just toddlers, but they would remember them well. They would know how to use them, albeit clumsily. Since it was during a weekday and they'd only been gone for a few hours, no one missed them in the dormitories after hours. Before climbing out of their beds, Hack had disabled each of their tracking devices that had been implanted during the early days of their infancy. One by one, the 5 escapees snuck through maintenance corridors of the center and crawled into the maintenance shaft of the vehicular. The hatch clicked shut with an unsettling finality. An awful stench wafted into their nostrils, and when they gathered their clothes, they realized where it was coming from. Not only did they need to look the part, but they also needed to smell the part. Then, they waited for what seemed like forever until suddenly they felt the forces around them shift suddenly as if they had gone from being static to being in motion. After exactly 20 minutes, the hydraulic brakes huffed and puffed as the vehicular came to a resting halt. Was downhill really within such a close reach? How could something so near seem so far away? When the maintenance hatch opened again, the 5 truth-seekers stumbled out of their vehicular. Once they got to the outside of the building, they activated their drones. The things were no larger than a brick, but as light as a pair of glasses and hovered right in front of their faces. The vertical blade spun so fast that it disappeared, and in its place a series of graphics that augmented their reality appeared, much like the contact lenses, but more analog and less hardwired to the brain. Noxious! This totally brings back memories. Aura was ecstatic about the retro device. Tully playfully yet seriously jabbed an elbow into elated Aura's side. Shh! Don't call attention to us. The night air was thick and damp, but not as damp as the street's surface. The potholes were dark, dank puddles with residue of petrochemicals turned rainbow, glistening on the surface. Dim, flickering lights lined the outer street. That particular street was narrow and was more of an alley than a street. And it was not something they were used to navigating uphill. Up above, streets were designated for driving or being driven on. If you wanted to go for a walk or to go people watching, you went to the mega commercial centers. The streets were for automated machines, the aces, ands, and other automated humanoid androids of the world. Those who were pedestrians relied heavily on algorithms to help them get around, mostly from one commercial center to the next. Hack projected a digital map of the surrounding area onto the alley wall. As part of the package, exploring downhill as a downhiller had obviously been a secret pastime for certain uphillers, since there seemed to be an established market for it. Hack got them a list of suggested public places to go to and observe without having to worry about standing out. The alley led to a much busier street. They stepped out from the alley onto a sidewalk, turning left to follow the overhang and wall. Somehow it was less disorienting to have a wall to lean on if need be. There were few other humans in the streets besides themselves. Pigeons were underfoot, and cats could be seen sheltering under rusted, metallic garbage dumpsters and other rubbish tossed to the curb. The oral contamination was disorienting. Large, hovering buses that transported people en masse huffed and squeaked by, their wake splashing puddles of gray water onto the curb. Apart from the general traffic din of the nocturnal life of the workers and city dwellers, the street was rather mundane and uneventful. That was until they reached the commercial district. For every 10th or so downhiller they passed in the street, there was a peace officer a few paces behind. Their shiny black uniforms reflected the dim lit lights that hung over the streets. Hack had been warned not to make eye contact with anyone, especially the uniformed thugs. Having been raised in homes of the heads of the institutions, all 5 of them knew all too well just how stern and abusive those officers' thugs could be. A strict hierarchy must be maintained, after all. How else better to maintain one than with the threat of violence and other religio-social coercive measures? Honor thy mother and father, a common household phrase, even if they beat you and make you drink your own urine. As the 5 approached the commercial district, they noticed that there were shouts and chants coming from up ahead. More officer thugs were coming out of the woodwork, so to speak, and heading toward the crowds from where the noise generated. Boots was the first to suggest that they duck into another alley. They needed to regroup. They had obviously stumbled upon a dangerously familiar scenario. They'd seen projections of the protests and manifestations and had even taken part in a few historical ones, playing the part of peace officers. It was one of the favorite games in the indoctrination center. Plugged into the server via the lenses, the player, from the perspective of an obedience enforcer, got to wear the disguise of a civilian and wreak havoc upon the protesters. Any weapon was fair game. The sharp, broken end of a placard pole was a favorite weapon to bludgeon with. Needless to say, the 5 shaken friends knew how this would end. It wouldn't be good. The chants seemed to be getting closer and closer as they could hear the foreboding voice of the sergeant on the loudspeakers from up ahead. As they ducked into the alley, their drone screens began to scramble and a picture of the sergeant, the top thug, appeared. It was a transmission on the emergency channel. This is an illegal congregation. Leave the area at once or risk detention and or possible death. I repeat, this is Sergeant Vargas. You are participating in an illegal demonstration. This is an illegal congregation. Leave the area at once or risk detention and or possible death. This is your last warning. The sergeant wore a black, glossy uniform. Her helmet covered most of her face except for the area below her dark brown, broad nose. Her voice was harsh and unapologetic. She meant business, and she knew that she and her entire force could get away with anything, any kind of punishment they decided to enact on the crowd. Suddenly, the general atmosphere in the distance changed. The so-called peace force began an offensive attack on the demonstrators. Canisters could be heard launching into the crowds, the sound of tin hitting the asphalt, and then a hiss as the acrid gas spewed its poison toward the people, who immediately began scattering. After only moments, the area was transformed into a foggy battlefield. Piercing screams and the thudding sounds of solid material smacking against bodies could be heard echoing through the streets. To further scatter the crowds, the police unleashed a spread of flash-bang grenades, an oldie but a goodie. Those weapons were particularly sinister. First, a whooshing sound filled the air. Then, as the sound of a small metal box crashing into the pavement in the middle of the crowd, a bright light flashed, temporarily blinding the onlooker before a piercing bang rumbled their eardrums, causing permanent hearing loss if close enough to the source. That was nothing like the simulated projections that the upillers played as entertainment. Although the sight, smell, touch, taste, and hearing senses were activated during the game, the simulation didn't even come close to the real thing. The poisonous gas made it difficult to breathe and burned the eyes of the unfortunate person who didn't have any personal protection equipment like goggles or a gas mask. Those items were difficult to come by downhill. But those who had connections with the upper-ups in the second and third economies could procure whatever they needed for a hefty cost, a kidney or maybe even an eye. The organ trade was still in full swing back then. "Crap! What do we do now?" Scrip spoke up, air voice trembling. Excited to get mixed up in the chaos, Boots interjected. "I say we go in there. Those people need help. It doesn't look like the protesters are being violent at all. It's nothing like the games portray it." "Yeah, these people don't even have weapons," agreed Telly. Boots and Telly tended to be the more feisty ones of the group, but again, their experience was solely based on projection games where you walk away in one piece and still breathing. That situation was much different. It was analog real, not virtually real. Someone could actually get hurt, could die. Suddenly, a group of 15 or so downhillers ran past the alley. 5 or 6 officer thugs followed close behind, holding raised batons and yelling after the ones they were chasing. The officer at the tail end looked down the alley where the 5 disguised downhillers sought refuge as he passed by. He slowed his pace, passing the alley, and then suddenly he was there again, blocking the alley and raising his voice toward them. "Hey, what are you doing out past curfew?" Aura, who was always quicker on her feet when it came to making excuses for spending too much time out of designated areas, spoke up loudly but with a gentle, timid tone. "We're sorry, officer. Our shift ended just a few minutes ago, and we got caught in this mess on our way back to the tenement," interjected Boots. Boots had been studying some of the linguistic features that the downhillers used for everyday things like where people lived, the foods they ate, and such. It was dark, and the alley was barely lit by the lights coming from the main street. The officer thug extended an arm straight out toward the cowering friends. A beam of bluish-white light shone from the top of the glove, blinding the 5 of them for a moment. The group flinched in unison. "Identify yourselves immediately. What are your numbers?" Just as their stomachs began to sink in terror, another officer came trotting by and stopped to talk with the officer that was interrogating them. "Come with me. We need all the troops that we can get at Pioneer Park. There's a full-on riot there. This is going to be fun." The officer lowered the blinding spotlight and told them to get home or else. Then the 2 officer thugs took off toward their new destination. You could hear the excitement in their voices. They were indeed having a good time. As the terrified 5's dumbfoundedness slowly began wearing off, someone cracked open a door a few strides behind them up the alley and called out, "Quick, in here!" A hand waved them toward the opening in a hurried motion. They were right to doubt what they had learned about the downhillers, Old Meshter continued. Old Meshter and the other thespians on the makeshift stage continued to narrate and reenact the tale of how 5 of the original 7 came to inhabit what is now the greater area they called home. After that eventful, horrifying night, the 5 16-year-olds never returned to their walled enclave uphill. In fact, they had gotten trapped with a slightly larger group of downhillers, surrounded by the violence and chaos they had witnessed outside the walls of the hideout. And over the next few days, they got to know that hideout very well. Unfortunately, the majority of the demonstrations were quashed. The injustice enforcers and the wannabe uphillers that stood beside them were eager to crush skulls, puncture flesh, and maim in any way possible. It brought them utter joy to cause such physical pain and psychological torment. And as proverbial icing on the cake, their actions went unpunished. If there were emergency medical services available to the downhillers, none came to the rescue. Injured and fatally wounded protesters could be seen seemingly flung about all along the west bank of the river and in sections all over the old financial center of the city and in places like Pioneer Park. Those among the demonstrators with emergency medical knowledge and experience were too overwhelmed to help all of the injured in need of attention. There were just too many people injured, especially after the bombings. Days turned into weeks, and the danger in the city grew worse. It was almost impossible to escape the smoke from the smoldering ruins of the city. It was when the law enforcement, along with the private military, began bombarding the city with projectile explosives that the group decided to flee. The downhillers and the people that lived in that particular city before the walls were erected had had a long history of providing mutual aid to each other in times of social upheaval. That unique moment in its history was no different. The bombs, however, were new for them, and old ways of doing grassroots community support and organizing weren't viable when buildings were being razed all around the city. People were forced to make a choice, stay and live in a war zone or flee to wherever they could find safety. Most people left on foot, but the group of Solidarity Unionists, the labor organizers who took in the 5 uphillers in disguise, had connections with the dock workers. The dock workers were, after all, some of the most powerful workers when it came to industrial union organizing. When you cut off the movements of goods, you could easily get the attention of the megacorps executives. And that city had always been an important commercial port. Since before the European marauders initially ravished, displaced, and murdered the local indigenous populations centuries earlier, the local people of the First Nations had used the interconnected rivers for travel and trade, and the city continued to be a major port up until the Great Dying. At least that is what the stories told. The 5 refugees and their new refugee companions found safety on a container dirigible that was headed halfway around the globe. That specific dirigible would sail against the western coastal current, heading south until it veered east, crossing the Loch Canal before reaching the longest leg of their journey. For those who had the funds to acquire the necessary credentials to travel by air, the same trip would only take a matter of several hours, but by sea, the trip was several days. Few port calls were made, and even then the stowaways were advised against leaving the dirigible. Several people did, though, of course. Some had connections in some of the southernmost sinking cities. The 5 friends would follow their new companions to the journey's end, where they would stay with other syndicalists who helped found a free zone. Salbodpesht was one of its names. All they had to do was get there, but that wouldn't be easy. And so 5 of 7 founders set off, no credits, no pack full of provisions. They were completely at the mercy of those who gave them help with no questions asked. They did offer skills, though. Each of the 5 went by names that they had come up with based on their most proficient skill set.
Aura was good at tale weaving and had quite the imagination. Aura's otherwise timorous demeanor would dissolve as soon as the storytelling began. And if Aura wasn't deeply submerged into an adventure projection through the ubiquitous ocular device, she was deep into making her own stories. Of course, that was forbidden and exciting. Boots was heavy into fighting projections and spent no less than 5 hours a day submerged. Boots's love for combat probably stemmed from the fact that Fair Father was a combat trainer and headed the wing of the peace force that specialized in using sadistic weapons and extremely violent and unethical tactics for the goal of enforcing peace, or rather, enforcing obedience. So, since Boots was able to walk, Faye trained with the automated master that Fair Father kept in the home gym. The gym itself was about the size of 6 of the containers that they traveled in on the dirigible. One container fit about 10 adults comfortably, arms stretched out above the head. About 15 people were sardined into that container. Telly, on the other hand, was a... Old Mester stops in mid-sentence, a loud scream coming from near the lesser-used gate, the one that Gomba and Takver, pretended to be Makk, were greeted at when they arrived at the camp only moments, tens of minutes earlier. There is trouble. The screaming comes to a sudden halt, almost muffled. The people are first frozen from the abrupt pause. Then, from the tree, Takver watches as several people scurry to stand up from their cross-legged seated positions. 5 or so adults take off in the direction that the scream came from. "Stay in there, Tak." Makk is now looking in her direction. Enough chaos ensues around the bonfires that they disappears from their family unit unseen. "I'm coming to you." The dogs get to the gate first. As Makk grabs a hold of the lowest branch and pulls themselves up, they gets a glimpse of the tail end of the pack running in the direction of their dwelling. Just as the adults get around the corner past the garden, A motorized vehicular of sorts crashes through the iron gates. 3, 4, no, 6 more follow. The screeching sound of metal dragging against metal can be heard clearly across the encampment all the way to the refectory. Upon hearing the shrill sound of metal, the roaring engines, and the barking and yelling, Takver freezes and seizes her inward conversation with Makk for an instant. It's all too familiar. She's immediately taken back to her compound, watching as the scenes of terror unfold. Makk, we have to get out of here. The look of horror on her face makes all the hair on Makk's body stand at attention. What in the scorching earth is happening? What do you know, Tak? We have to get out of here, now. I can't leave my people behind. I have to fight. As the two scramble down the side of the beech tree closest to the wooded edge, people are frantically running past them in all directions. Makk looks back toward the refectory, where the elders and the youngest children are taking refuge inside its great hall. It's part of the drills that the community does ever so often during scorching hours. The safety committee has been administering these exercises ever since the raids began to increase a few years back. It's normal Atmaneti protocol. The elderly and the youngest of the youngins are to take shelter in the refectory, hide, run, then fight if necessary. Back at the smashed gate, growls and barks turn to screeches and yipes. Several adults are splayed across the ground, clutching their hands against their ears. While one marauder is working away at tying their hands behind their backs, another 2 vehiculars drive into the encampment. You can't, Makk. There are too many of them. As Makk and Takver sneak into Makk's Intim-unit's dwelling, Makk catches a glimpse of Fur with their teeth locked onto a marauder's cloak. A second later, another marauder is there with a metal pipe of some sort and swings it at Fur. It all happens in slow motion. The pipe connects with Fur's face, and they falls backward onto their side. A loud thump as their body hits the ground. Fur doesn't move, while blood pours from their broken snout. Makk begins to scream and run toward Fur, who continues to lie motionless on the moonlit ground. Takver wraps her arms around Makk's mouth and pulls them into the dwelling backward. The 2 fall from the force, Takver underneath a struggling Makk. Several other wounded dogs limp toward the various adults, who are held in some silent but seemingly painless trance. 7 marauders work almost methodically, tying up the helpless adults. Under the smashed gate, 3 dogs lay dead. The other dogs are either missing, severely wounded, or dead, too. Makk is kneeling on the nettle mat flooring near the half-hung hammocks. Tears pour down from their face as muffled wails squeeze through the cracks of Takver's fingers. Her hand is soaking wet from the first warm, then cold sailing tears. We have to get out of here, Tak repeats in silence, red hues flashing through Makk's mind's eye. After getting a grip on the reality of the situation, Makk scrambles to stand up. Their gear is in the corner, already packed from the water-fetching journey. Makk grabs it. Takver peeks through the cracks in the thatched walls. Fires are being set to various dwellings along the corridor of the camp. Tens of marauders are dragging the helpless people, adults and children, all incapacitated, to the vehiculars. As they creep through the back exit of the dwelling and out through the aperture that Makk had created many holes back, Makk sees their people being thrown into the vehiculars, stacked atop of one another by 2 or 3 of the marauders. And just as Takver tugs at Makk's cloak to pull them back out of view, Makk catches a glimpse of the shiny, ring-like objects atop the heads of 2 of the marauders, and blurts a choking whisper, "Those scorching rings again." Then the 2 refugees are off, Makk's home in flames growing more and more diminutive as they run deeper into the forest.